Do we have 3 people who were at that meeting? I can't remember who was at that last meeting.
I think so, yes.
Okay, so I think if we all, yeah, that's right, we had a full house, didn't we? We did. So I moved to approve our minutes from our previous meeting of the Village Planning Board.
Wait, Jen, before we do that, just like we opened at like 7:04 and then we should do roll call again.
Okay, is Dennis, Dennis, are you here?
Yeah.
Is that Dennis?
Yes.
Okay, Dennis is here too. Okay, so we have a quorum, sorry, so back to where I was before. We don't have any applications on our agenda today, so we're not going to have any of that business today. We have some limited administrative business, which I think we can just go right through now, and then we can talk about the kind of 2 subject matters that I put on the agenda for us to workshop as a group and for the public to have access to. And for one of those, Tom and his colleagues are going to speak to us about the angle or the issue that involves HPC.
And John, I don't think there's anyone here, but just if you want to say that make sure no one's here for public comment. I don't see anybody and I'm not getting anything on the YouTube.
Right, that's what I was saying before is ordinarily I would move now to open public comment, but because we're in this different format, rather than moving to open public comment, I'm just going to note that we've got a YouTube channel that has a comment function where people can leave chats, and they should leave chats, and they can also email into the planning and zoning secretary email to make a public comment. So I'll move that we adopt that procedure for public comment for this meeting. So I have a second to that.
Second.
And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Even though we can see, I guess I should do the roll call. Tom, what's your vote?
Aye.
Raquel, your vote?
Aye.
Dennis, your vote?
Aye.
And I vote aye as well.
Okay.
Okay, so that's how we'll handle public comment. Now I'm going to ask, I'm going to move for approval of the meeting minutes at our last meeting, which I believe we do have people who were there who can do that. So I vote aye. Tom? Oh, do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, now I vote aye. Tom?
Abstain.
Oh,
You
yeah.
weren't here? Okay. Raquel?
Aye. I believe it was there.
Dennis?
Yes, you were.
Dennis? You with us?
Aye.
Maybe you're muted. Oh, thank you. Okay. So that's all of us are counted for, so the minutes are approved. And just quickly, I don't think, we don't have Bill with us, do we, Alana?
Oh, no, I don't see him. I haven't heard from him today.
And since we're going to, hear from Tom and I presume maybe Camilla as well during this kind of larger discussion of the 2 different proposed amendments to the village code, I'm going to ask Don Kerr, who's here from the EPB, is their liaison. Is there any kind of liaison update that you can? Oh, I'm sorry. I chose just that moment to start talking to Don while he was. Don, I'm sorry. I was going to close out our administrative business. I was just going to ask whether or not you had any kind of liaison reporting to do to us as a board from the EPB before we moved on to the kind of subject matters.
I appreciate that. I was unable to attend the last EPB meeting, so I do not have any report.
Okay. So that should be the end of our administrative business that was listed on our agenda. So what's left on the agenda is kind of these 2 workshop items.
John, do you just want to mention, you had me add into the administrative business about further planning board?
Right. Yeah. And so I'll thank you. Just kind of like bringing that forward. After we go through this kind of workshopping of these 2 proposed amendments to the village code, then what we'll do is we will go into an executive attorney-client session with Rick, who is going to both provide us some training as to comprehensive planning. And during that same time, we can talk about just doing training for ourselves as a board then, and address that item then, if that, unless anyone's an issue with that. So that's how I was planning on proceeding. And with that, I would just go to that, the kind of first subject matter about HPC. But first, anyone on the board have any concerns or issues with proceeding that?
No.
No.
Okay, hearing no concerns with that, why don't we do that? So why don't we turn to the first of these 2 proposed amendments that I had kind of flagged for us to talk about. Now, just kind of big picture background, my understanding is that both of the items, what have I done here? Sorry if you can't see. I've now made it impossible. I don't know how this has happened. Just 1 second. Sorry, everybody. There we go. Both of the proposed code changes, one of them is very obviously to the zoning code because it's about amending the use table. That's the second of these two kind of areas I want to talk about. The first one is mostly about, HPC, but it does include changes. If you look at the stuff that's been proposed, it includes changes to the zoning law as well. And it also talks about our activities as a planning board and what kind of votes we need to have. And so it turns out that both of these sets of proposed changes, if they come through seeming like they're coming through now, would look like they would need our kind of review and a provision of an advisory memo to the village board before they have a public hearing to, decide whether or not to make these kinds of changes. So I thought it was important for us to just try to get on top of that and start, talking about it, knowing what this stuff was, because I think it's like 45 days that we get to do an advisory memo, and it may well be that the village would like to get some of this stuff done faster than that. So I thought I'd help, us get into a position to at least think about these things if and when and as soon as the village board asks us to, so that maybe we don't need 45 days to come up with an advisory memo about either of these kind of changes or going forward, anything like this. So the first of the two involve these changes to the process of getting a certificate from HPC, which would go from applications coming out of the historic district to all applicants in the village, but all property owners in the village. And so I thought it was important for us to hear from Tom, thank you so much, Tom, for the information you sent over previously and shared with us, and for coming now and joining us. And I'm really eager for here and for the board to hear where these changes came from, what's the vision, what's the idea, and how you guys see it all working out, and just kind of hear that, and then we can all discuss hopefully and figure out where we go with that discussion from there. But I thought it'd be the smartest thing we do to start with Tom, if that's okay with you, Tom.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, John, thank you very much. And thanks everybody. Am I audible? Is it about the right?
Yes.
Okay. I really appreciate your taking the time and giving us a little bit of your agenda. What I thought I would do is just as briefly as possible, recap the intent of what we're doing, or just lay that out in a couple of points, go over the chronology of how we got to May 2020. And then if people want me to, we can go into the actual sections that we're proposing. There aren't that many. It's actually two sections of chapter 9. I'm sorry, 3 sections of chapter 9, 2 sections of 212, and 86.4 follows because of the changes that we're proposing. So it's not a lot of code to look at, but I'm happy to do that if you want. And then I thought we could also talk about some of the safeguards that we're thinking about to ensure that what we are proposing makes sense in the long term, because there has been quite a lot of discussion, which I'm happy to say has kind of taken the form of praise, that this particular HPC seems to be well thought of, but we have to be thinking about safeguards to future HPCs. So John, if that's okay, I'm going to just kind of chunk those out and go through. And I think it would be great if you have questions or want to stop me at any point. I'm happy to answer. The intent of what we're doing is, number one, to, we think, better fulfill the mandate that exists in Chapter 9, Article 3, which is where the HPC is created in Village Code. That happened in 2001. That's when the HPC was formed. So we're coming up to 20 years of our existence. And that mandate asks us to protect and enhance the landmarks and historic districts, which represent distinctive elements of the historic, architectural, and cultural heritage of the village. So it's a pretty broad mandate. I mean, there's architecture in there, there's local history, and there's local culture in those. We are supposed to focus attention on and foster civic pride. And you can tell I'm reading, I'm going from section 916 if you want to follow along. Thirdly, we're supposed to protect and enhance the attractiveness of the village to visitors and to support and provide stimulus to the local economy. So there's an economic dimension to this that's tied to historic and cultural character. And fourthly, we're supposed to ensure the harmonious, orderly, and efficient growth and the development of the village. And obviously that's a place where our efforts coincide pretty closely, because that's, of course, your mandate as well. As we thought about this, and I should probably say that this has been brewing for the better part of 3 years, and in some form even longer, but definitely in a focused way for at least 3 years. One of the things that has occurred to us is that we can probably make the approval process more transparent and more systematic and more coordinated, so that we're not in our silos. And this is just natural. I think it's absolutely natural with volunteer boards that we all have, most of us have day jobs. We do this on the side. We do this out of civic responsibility. And so there's a tendency to kind of stay in our silos. And actually, as part of that, we wanted to try to ease the workload on the planning board, because at the moment, most of this village doesn't have any oversight by historic preservation, which means some of those issues fall to you. And I'm really aware of how many things the planning board has to think about that are way beyond the historic character of buildings. You have to think about road usage, you have to think about drainage, you have to think about really big infrastructure things. And so for that matter, does the building department. And so after 20 years of serving on this board, it has occurred to me and to others on the commission that we can probably take some of that off the planning board in a systematic way. We've been doing this in a kind of ad hoc, case-by-case way for a long time, but there's nothing in the village code that automatically directs projects that might have an impact on historic character to us so that we can advise you or make a determination. The other thing that we were trying to accomplish, and you must hear this too, that you get a kind of angry response from developers and architects sometimes that the village seems kind of uncoordinated in this respect, and that they have to do extra drawings, they have to come to extra meetings, they have to hire consultants. And we thought that in some way we could ease the burden on especially new development, but maybe reconstructive development, by making it clear what the process is, having our services as a consultation or a determination early in the process so that they don't have to churn through so many cycles. And that creates bad will, it takes up people's time, and we'd like to try to avoid that. The other thing that we're trying to avoid, and I think people will be really sensitive to this, is the how the hell did you let that happen syndrome. So this has happened to me many times, and so has it for other people on the commission. There's an assumption in the village, especially with respect to downtown, that we actually have oversight over that section, and we don't. We flat out don't. The historic center of the village has we have no oversight powers there or anywhere else except Huguenot Street. And so you get this question from the public. They know that there's a historic preservation commission, and they can't understand how we can have a state and national register district downtown and have no local oversight. But that's actually how it works. Those forms of honor don't come with any automatic local oversight. And so we'd like to avoid that, where people, in various degrees of anger or disappointment, approach us or approach the planning board and say, how the hell did you let that through? Or why is this thing approved? And so we'd like to, that's sort of the public facing side of this. We'd like to do a better job of that mandate, where we're truly and conspicuously looking after the interests of the village. So that's kind of that's the intent. We feel like we're building on the legislative intent of what the Historic Preservation Commission is supposed to be doing in the first place. A lot of that builds on things from Chapter 9, Section 16, Section 19 and 23 are the ones especially that seem to touch that. In terms of chronology, so second major thing I wanted to say, in terms of chronology, it was at least 3 years ago, and maybe a little bit more, that we first started talking in a concrete way about this. So I met early on with Tim, with Neil Betts. At one point in our discussion, there was some question about whether this should be New Paltz-wide rather than village-wide. Pretty early in the process, we decided the village is better off going alone because our circumstances are different. I remember distinctly meeting with Dennis at one point. I don't remember the date of that meeting, but I do remember that we, in March of last year, so March 19, we had our first version from our attorney, Will Frank, outlining some legislative changes. And then on July 30th of last year, we had a pretty long meeting with Eve, who used to be your chair, where we went over that. We consulted with her. We put on board some of the suggestions and changes that she asked for. Over the fall of last year and into the early part of this year, we made those refinements and ultimately presented them on the 20th of March to the village board. I will say that I think a mistake that I made, and I want to apologize to you all, was assuming after that July meeting that the planning board was really current with what we were doing. And I think especially with the change of leadership and Eve's departure, something fell through the cracks that I definitely wouldn't have wanted to fall through the cracks. And so I'm glad that, John, you raised the issue, what was it, last week or 2 weeks ago, so that we can get back on track. Since March 20th, when I first presented it at a village board meeting, we've had 2 subsequent workshop meetings. One was April 22nd. The other was March 6th, at which we pretty much did the same thing, presented to the village board what we're thinking about. And at the last meeting in particular, tried to address some of the concerns that John raised in his letter. I think of that same day, 5-6, a number of pretty substantive things that we should talk about. So everybody, I think I would rather pause now. We can get into the specifics of the code at any point, but is there anything I can clarify about the intent of what we're doing or the chronology that gets us to May 2020?
Why don't I say this? I'm going to hold all of my comments and questions until the very end, but why don't I just ask everyone else to jump in here with Tom if they've got questions or comments they want to raise right now with, as he said, what he's just gone through. So I'll start. Tom.
Tom, I think you're muted.
I'm sorry. I don't think I have anything particular. I think I followed the line of your thinking over the past several years about how the HPC can be both more effective with a broader mandate and a more specific mandate, and how that could serve to lighten some of the load of the planning board, off the planning board. But what I wonder is, does it increase the load for the HPC membership, which again is all volunteer personnel? And how does it change what you have to do in a significant way? But I understand the points that you were making, except for this one.
Yeah, Well, you're certainly right, and I might ask Camilla to help me with this. We had a very serious discussion about that because at present, we meet 10 times a year typically. We will often have an 11th meeting to get something through so that we're not holding up a client, but our usual intent is to meet once a month, 10 times a year. We skip July and we skip December typically. Our meetings, a good meeting is an hour and 15 minutes. That would be actually a really good meeting. A bad meeting can be almost twice that long. So it was a pretty serious discussion about what we would be putting on ourselves. But the feeling was unanimous that if an HPC is going to exist and we're doing this for the community, that we're willing to roll up our sleeves. And that might mean 12 times a year. That might even mean a more frequent schedule, but the commission's ready to do it.
Okay.
Camilla, do you want to comment? I mean, it might help to hear your perspective on that conversation, which we had more than once, actually.
I think we all feel strongly about helping New Paltz retain its historic character and work towards that. And we are willing to put in the extra work.
And it's feasible. I guess the question that I would have is not about your, moral commitment, but is it realistic and feasible for you, given the personnel that you have and that you are busy about other things, that you would take on additional and maybe significant additional tasks?
Yeah, it remains to be seen. I mean, I may want to slip in a really important point here, which is a lot of things that people want to do are considered like for like replacement. And so a large part of what we're talking about here is going to be approval without a process. In other words, the building department or the planning board or the client themselves want to do a project, they contact the village, we find out what it is and we say, go ahead, it's recorded that you want to, replace this or that or redo the roof or whatever. And we don't need to spend any time really on that. I think the other thing, Tom, sort of goes toward the sort of moral readiness. There's something brewing this week, and I didn't particularly want to bring specific cases into our discussion, but the specific case illustrates why the commission feels like if we're going to do this, let's do it right. At the corner of Main and Chestnut is Lola's Restaurant. Yes. I think everybody knows it. They're redoing their steps and retaining wall, kind of an emergency basis. So that maybe shades this in a slightly different direction, but that's actually a really sensitive building. It's a very historic building that has little by little been lost basically for historic purposes. And so we were brought in last week on a very short notice to give some informal advice on what could be a really significant landscaping feature. They're going to need a high retaining wall, they're going to need landscaping, and they're going to need a patio to replace the current patio. And I feel like if years ago the village had worked out what we're trying to work out now, we wouldn't be in that spot. Everybody would know up front that you occupy a historic building in a sensitive part of the village. There's a process. The commission doesn't charge anything for consultation or our process, and we would have a better looking downtown. I'm focusing on downtown because it's our anticipation that most of the sensitive cases are going to come from that part of the village. But I think we all know, as you look around the village, architectural degradation doesn't usually happen with a bulldozer. It happens little by little, steps, walkways, windows, siding, an addition here that isn't really thought about. And pretty soon you have problems. And if anybody got a chance to see the video that we put together, there's about a 2-minute segment in that video where we illustrate what happens when nobody's watching the farm. And, you know, pretty soon a community doesn't look very good. And it's very, very hard to come back from that. So I'm sorry for it's a little bit of a digression, but it sort of illustrates why the HPC feels like there is a mandate to do these things, and we're kind of hamstrung at the moment in not really having a voice or a place in the process. And we're willing to do it. And
Appreciate that, Tom.
yeah.
All right, if I could, I know that Don from EPB has some specific questions, but before, I just want to run through and give other members of the board just a chance to ask Tom any questions or comments, again, about what he's focused on so far, if we could, and try to get through real quick. Dennis, do you have anything?
No, is this only in regard to areas that are designated historic sections of the village?
No, I'm going to get to that, and I'm saving all of my kind of comments kind of to turn back to a members discussion at the end. But no, this would apply to everywhere in the village. Raquel?
Yeah, I'm just following along so far. No questions as of yet.
Okay, and so Don, I'll open the floor to you and questions you've got.
Well, I specifically did not want to.
Don, could I just answer Dennis's question? Just because that's something I might have included in our narrative. So there was a point in the thinking about these changes that we had to decide whether this was going to be a village-wide initiative or strictly a downtown initiative. And one model, Dennis, was we take the currently defined sanctioned zone of the downtown district, which has state and national register. It's been vetted and vetted and vetted.
Right.
And we could basically apply what we do on Huguenot Street to that downtown area, which I'll be honest was my instinct. That was my suggestion. The mayor felt strongly otherwise, and I think he does have a point, and I think I've probably come around to see that those of us who don't live in that downtown largely business area of the village still ought to enjoy some basic protections on the street on which we live. And John and I had a bit of a conversation about this on the 5th, and I'm looking forward to getting back to it because it's not easy. I mean, to do something village-wide is scarier. It feels bigger. But I have to say our thinking is that there are more and less sensitive parts of the village, and at least this HPC is fully prepared to deal with them according to their historic significance, not abstract ideas of what's pretty or aesthetically pleasing, but where we have sort of historic stock outside the downtown. So it's a really good question, Dennis, and I was sort of anticipating the question, and I really just forgot to include it in my narrative of how we got here, but that was a huge question, you know, whether we're just targeting what's obvious and already sanctioned or trying something a little more ambitious with the understanding that our energies are going to be focused differently according to the age and the historic character of a house or a neighborhood.
Well, listen, Tom, you've done a terrific job, and I think of things in the downtown section, and you know where I live on Plains Road, going over towards Water Street. If you had your way, things would look a lot different. And I think what you said at the outset, it would increase tourism, increase monetary income to the village. I think your whole concept is great. The only thing I bring up is, you know, if, for example, I built the house over here 2 years ago, you know, if I would have had, or not just me, someone come in and say, no, you can't have that kind of siding or the color or something like that. I think two things are going to happen. One is it's going to, you know, create some issues for the planning board as well as the building department. And I don't really know if that's really your intention, you know, to focus on just someone putting, like Mancuso's house across the street from mine. Is Victorian, beautiful house. I don't know if that would have met with, you know, the HPC guidelines. So I think if we get too far away from designated historic sections of the village, you're going to run into a lot of work, and I just don't see it being a positive.
Mm-hmm. It's a legitimate concern, Dennis. I don't know what we would have done in that specific case, because I mean, we'd be looking at all kinds of particulars, but I mean, we're really aware of that decision, and the mayor was, you know, adamant that village-wide is the way to go. But that doesn't mean it has to be the answer. I mean, that's partly what we're talking about tonight.
All right. Can I ask? So I asked Raquel already. Thank you, Raquel. And now let me ask Don for give you the floor for your questions.
Well, I'm wearing two hats tonight. So I have one question.
Please, both hats are welcome.
Liaison. Just from that standpoint, I wonder if the same goals could not be achieved simply by having a member of the HPC as a liaison to the planning board and deal with the same issues and remediating the same issues in that way, which would seem to be a viable option. And I had 4 questions I sent as a member of the public on the YouTube page by chat. I don't know how to separate my roles here.
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with you addressing things from your perspective as liaison and your duties there, and then you could say, and as a private citizen, this is my opinion, and that's entirely appropriate.
Okay. I guess as a private citizen, I wonder, if the goal is to ease the process, I wonder how adding a new layer of authority and a new layer of review eases the process. And I guess a related question is if one of the main goals of this concept is to take the burden off the planning board, I wonder if the planning board has expressed a sense of having a burden that they want removed. I guess I had 2 other questions, but those would be my primary ones.
Mm-hmm. Good, both of them. Good. Planning board compositions do change, and at the time when it formed in my mind that the planning board wanted relief, it was under Michael Zeeler's term as chair. So I'm not sure I want to speak for the current or any future board. I am sensitive. I mean, having looked at many planning board documents over the years, I'm sensitive to how much you have to think about. And I guess also sensitive to the fact that members of the HPC particularly focus on architectural details, like, really work from standards that are universally accepted or some version of that universally accepted. But that's a conversation we can have. If there's not a problem here and if there's another way out, I don't think the HPC is against anything that achieves the same goal. I really think we're all talking about the same thing, which is we don't want to see our community degraded by losing the architectural specificity and authenticity that we have left. Don, I don't know if I've answered that adequately.
Yeah, I do. I guess I should take the next or the follow-up comment to the mayor. My house was built in 1963, and I wonder what the justification is for a historic preservation commission having authority over a non-historic property or area. But it sounds like that came from Tim. So maybe I should go to a village board meeting and ask that question.
Well, I mean, I think that's a legitimate thing to ask. I can tell you how I would answer it, which is that in all likelihood, your house wouldn't get that kind of scrutiny. I think I even know which house it is, Don. Are you on North Oakwood?
No, Mill Rock Road.
Mill Rock. Most of that neighborhood is sort of 50s, 60s, 70s houses that have an integrity of their own. And I think one of the misconceptions is that somehow HPCs always want to drive things back and, make houses what they never were. I think the difference is that we've got some streets in the village that do have houses from the 20s or before. I actually live on a street that has some turn of the century houses. And I think that's where an HPC can kind of get into the nuances of what's around it. We have a vocabulary and training to think about those. But you're expressing something that's definitely on our mind, which is that we don't want to be seen as the architecture Gestapo of New Paltz, right? This is an effort that should ultimately be something that's rational, makes sense for the community, makes sense for the people living next to and in the structures that would fall under our scrutiny. So I think my quick answer is a house from 1963 surrounded by houses from 1963 should adhere to that pretty broad aesthetic and not, we're not trying to do anything that's out of character to that time period.
All right. On that note, oh, I'm sorry, Dennis, will you jump again?
No, I'm okay.
Okay, I wanted to turn to Rick, because our attorney, because Rick has a question for Tom.
Hi, Tom. Rick Golden, attorney for the board. The one thing that I was curious about, because you were talking about one of the impetuses for these code changes and the intent was because there were certain areas in the downtown that you really don't have any jurisdiction to formally weigh in and make recommendations on. And there may be some other individual properties that you don't want to sort of see by incremental changes being changed so that it changes the entire character of what would be a very nice property and the buildings on it. But in looking at the present code, there's a process by which you can make recommendations to the planning board regarding applications for site plan or subdivision if the real property contains landmarks or is within an historic district. And then there's the following section 9-20
Right.
that says you can ask the Board of Trustees to designate a district and designate individual properties. And I guess my question is, why isn't that process sufficient where you'd simply ask the Board of Trustees to designate an area as historic and designate individual properties, and then you can have your input into the planning board process? It's really just a question of, maybe a follow-up to the additional layers. But I mean, if there's a process already in place where your input on individual applications before the planning board can have a very effective process, why isn't that being used?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I probably should have said something, which is the HPC principally does two things now. One is any property within the Huguenot Street district, any exterior change has to be at least brought to our attention. And if it's not a repair and replace situation, then we have a process that could be expedited. It could be very fast. It could be 2 meetings for external changes. And then the other thing we do is there are 11 properties within the village that are outside Huguenot Street that are individually landmarked. What that means is that the same restrictions fall on those 11 properties. So we're talking about Elting Library. We're talking about the schoolhouse that now has the oil. It just changed hands. Used to be the
Scarborough
toy
Fair.
shop. Yeah, Scarborough Fair. These are the Old Main on the college campus. I'm sorry, that's wrong. That was a different designation. There's a house on Center Street, a perfect example of bungalow style construction. So we have overview over a discrete number of properties that we have actively landmarked, and we have control over Huguenot Street. And I think, Rich, it gets back to that question that we faced really early in this process. So what happens if we only do that? What happens to the other neighborhoods that may have a historical character that should be preserved, but don't necessarily rise to the standard of landmarking? That would be our only way to do it. And I can kind of see two ways forward. One is the path of least resistance always seemed to me to take the state and national register district and treat it the same way that we treat Huguenot Street. And I think that would be I think it would be a very easy case to make. I think there'd be broad support in the community for that. But then what it's going to do, the consequence of that is anything outside that district has to go through a laborious process of individual designation. And I think we're going to miss a lot of properties that may not rise to that fairly high standard, but nonetheless contribute to the quality of a particular neighborhood. So I'm thinking about Prospect Street, I'm thinking about Grove Street, I'm thinking about parts of Center Street and South Oakwood, where, you know, I'm not sure there are that many landmarkable properties in there, but nonetheless, people in those neighborhoods, I think, can expect or should be able to expect some kind of protection. On the 5th of May, when we were speaking with John, I raised the specter of a house that's on the corner of John Street and Grove Street. I live on Grove, John lives down the hill on Prospect. We both know the house we're talking about. It was a beautiful bungalow style house that received years ago planning board permission to expand by about 150%. And the siding doesn't match. This undifferentiated rectangle is attached to this house that has lines and architectural integrity. And that's kind of my poster child. If you let that happen, then you never get those properties back. That property will always be a boarding house because it's now built for that. And we lost a bungalow house that definitely had architectural integrity, definitely fit into the neighborhood. And I think it's questionable whether it ever would have been defensible as a landmarking. So I'm sorry for the long answer, Rick, but I think that's the thinking, that there's this kind of area in the middle that deserves protection, but may not rise to the level of individual landmarking.
Okay, so I do want to try to get through our whole agenda if we can. And so, you know, Tom, I know that you had I think you had gotten to a point where you thought you were X% through your presentation, but what I'd like to ask is, could you give us kind of maybe your whatever else you wanted to say in, say, 5 minutes or less, so that we can just try to get everything that's really essential from your perspective. Yeah. And then we can kind of close out this discussion and move on to the other one and our other agenda items. And almost certainly we're going to be revisiting the subject. This is not the last time we'll be talking, but I just wanted to give you a chance to give your kind of, you know, parting thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it, John. And believe me, I don't want to be longer than I need to. But I think that we're everybody who cares about the community is kind of confronted with this decision. And I think the decision boils down to continuing to do nothing is a guarantee that slowly the architectural distinction of New Paltz slips away. It goes doorway by doorway, goes roof line by roof line, window by window. That's really how it works. Unless a community is suddenly distressed by like the loss of a major employer, then you can kind of see wholesale things happen. So I think we're pulling toward the same goal. We don't want that to happen. And I think we recognize that it has been happening, and we've got this kind of strange arrangement where there's no villain in any of this. It's just that, you know, at an earlier point in the composition of the village code, this wasn't thought about enough that there's a systematic process. So I think, to Rick's question and to others, you know, we're really struggling with the best way forward. And what we came up with is this village-wide solution with basically this understanding that we're trying to build into the code proposal, that not every structure gets treated the same way, not every neighborhood gets treated the same way. The other way to go is a more conservative way of just looking at the downtown district, path of least resistance. But I feel like there's a consequence to the outlying neighborhoods if you do that. So that's really, John, what we're here for, I think, is to get your input. And I've been taking notes all along, to get your input, to try to anticipate what the public response would be, what the cost benefit of this larger, broader approach would be. And I'm absolutely certain that we're going to keep talking about this. We know that this is just early days of the code proposal. So I think I'll stop there and hope that I do have your agreement on that first point, that we all want an attractive community that honors its past, that lets things move forward in some disciplined or sensible or thoughtful way. And I think that's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I've got some kind of my input for today, which is going to involve that this will go on and we will talk more and kind of laying out for my fellow board members what I and the public what I think is the next step procedurally. But I wanted to check in with the board members first to see if anyone else has any questions or comments just on this subject before I kind of give my 2 cents and then move us on the agenda. So Tom?
Yeah, one question. This village has not adopted design standards, and would it not be, would having design standards not be a different way to effect the same kind of outcome? And because design standards don't have to be universal through the community, they can be adapted to different components of the community.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. Yes, we could do it that way. And there are communities that do. There are pros and cons to that. I mean, I think in a way, Tom, what we're proposing implicitly has design standards. I think probably everybody's familiar with our little booklet, which has been circulated at various points. And those are, I think they're design standards in a very manageable way, as opposed to the way that some communities go, which is they get into really long manuals with really technical stuff about what you can and can't do. And that, I think early in our discussion of the process, I think there was some fear that too much specificity is going to feel very restrictive to the public. They're not going to go for it, as opposed to, I think there are only 9 guidelines in that booklet that then are applied, as design standards in a very broad way.
Yeah. I know that this could be a very long conversation, but I just want that on the table somewhere for our consideration.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Tom, and we've kicked it around.
Dennis?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, and as I say, I'm 100% supportive of Tom's. But at this point, I'd like to just see, a little bit more where this is going. Design standards. The thing that I guess that's my concern is this good? And I know what Tom said. There are certain buildings on different streets that stand out as architectural benefits dating back, but I just see it to be something that's really going to be difficult to do on every street within the village. You have houses that were built back in the 50s, 60s. You have houses built, this year. So I don't know how you got to designate what you want a specific area to look like within that regard. So that's why for my part is I think we have to structure what area you really want to focus on that if you do these design standards or adhere to the HPC standards, improve the community, going throughout the entire village, I think is going to add a lot more work for the planning board, for the building department, and certainly for Tom Olson and his group. So that's my only concern. Why this, wide approach? Can't we just like we did? This is going back a couple of years when I was on a committee. They wanted to change the Water Street zoning. It was village zoned as a flood area, and that did not allow those houses to be really modified or had any work. Rich Steffens owned one of them. And we changed that. We changed it to the gateway area so they could come in and make improvement and so forth. I think that's sort of the approach I'm looking at. What is the area that we want to focus on? And certainly I like Don's idea, have a liaison from HPC on the planning board. So when a project comes up in one of these areas that we've designated as an area that is within this this change of the approach, then we can focus on it. But when you see so many applications come through for just minor changes on different streets, if we have to have HPC approve or get into each one of those, it seems like a very long process and probably holds up the homeowner from getting work done that they want to have done quickly.
Okay, Raquel?
Yeah, no, I had similar thoughts along the line with Tom and Dennis. I think obviously whatever modifications are made are also going to increase the burden of responsibility for HPC as well as for us. So I do like the idea of having a liaison work with us to kind of help us navigate any new or additional terms. It does concern me, but I understand that as time progresses and people are adding newer modifications to existing structures, that we do have to adjust the existing language to kind of reflect those changes. So I'm with Dennis in the sense that I look forward to just seeing sort of more specifically what those design guidelines would look like. But yeah,
okay. I'm gonna close it out with on this part of our agenda. And thanks in advance, Tom and Camilla and your entire group for the work you're doing. And I know we're going to be continuing this. And just at the beginning, remember everyone always, I cannot give the board legal advice, even though I sometimes will talk about the law and feel that it's part of my job to do that as the planning board chair. And give my view, and then we'll get legal advice separately from our lawyers. And I will let you know that the various matters I'm going to briefly run through here are matters that I have been told by the mayor that we are supposed to be having some kind of legal consultation between at least myself and the mayor and Rick and the village's attorney about some of these questions that I've asked and that I want to make sure you guys know about. I'll be honest, I am a little concerned because there is no public audience for our meeting tonight. From what it seems like Don's the only YouTube attendee, I think. There's us on the Zoom call, but I maybe other people will watch this later. But I was at virtually the previous village board meeting where this was discussed, where I heard about it for the first time, basically. There was no real, it seemed like, public participation there. I don't know about previous instances. But this is really concerning to me. I will tell you, and again, I'm not looking for any responses here, and except maybe Rick later when we're kind of just with the board members and getting legal advice, we can talk if you have any initial impressions. But I don't think this is legal. Even if I thought it was legal, I don't think it's a good idea. The details are available in the documents that were linked on the village board's website. And my understanding, to answer your question, I think Rick, and also the question I think Tom, everyone was raising, is village could just designate proper historic districts, even if not every house in the landmark. They could designate the Main Street Historic District if they want to. I mean, yes, it doesn't have protection automatically by being a National Historic District, but the village board could designate it as one. It could designate where I live, and others have talked about on the north side of Main Street. You know, it's a cognizable historic district. Same thing by the residences by the college or down by you, Dennis, along Plains Road and the waterfront. You know, the issue is that there is a process for that, for landmarking buildings, or my understanding is, or declaring historic districts. And then there has to be public hearings, and people who live in those districts have rights to come out and contest that they should be in the district, or that these should be the regulations that apply to their home for being in that district. And to the point of the design standard question, you know, the real issue there is that no, there's not going to be. The idea is that this would be a statement that the design standards are this HPC process. And in addition to that, I just want the board members to understand that this proposal, you know, applies to everything in the village and applies to things that don't even need our site plan review. So I think to kind of the questions you were asking, Dennis, as it's written right now, as for every house in the village, if you want to put in 2 pane windows instead of 4, you want to change the color of your front door from black to red, you want to put lighting on your front path, you want to hang the American flag from your porch, you need to fill out an application for a certificate of appropriateness to the HPC, and they will have up to 62 days to decide whether they're going to waive a public hearing on your application. You don't have to pay for the application, but if you are found in non-compliance according to the law that's being proposed, the building inspector is supposed to fine you like they would if you didn't have a building permit. My concern is this kind of thing getting debated and approved, and us going through, you know, basically an hour of a meeting about it. And I'm pretty sure for all of you, that's the first you're understanding that that's what we're talking about here. Is that people are going to wake up and find out, wait a second, I need to fill out paperwork to, you know, change my front door, change my windows, put up a flag, let alone anything more significant than that. Again, it's not even stuff that requires a building permit, but not our site plan review. It's anything except for a few exceptions that are in the law, like paint colors, but the HPC will give you a list of nice colors, and a couple of other de minimis things. But mostly you need to fill out this paperwork and get this government approval for what you want to do with your house, even though it's not in any recognized historic district. There's nothing historic about it. The other issue with the way the law is written now, or one of another issues, is that it doesn't talk about its effect on the buildings around it. It only talks about whether or not it's going to substantially degrade the architectural or aesthetic appeal of the specific property. So basically it would be up to HPC to decide whether the way you're going to change your driveway layout is aesthetically pleasing. And I have no concerns that the current HPC is at all interested in this, but that's the way the law is written. And that's the power that it would give to the HPC. And it would take power away from our board in a way that I think, and I'm waiting for the legal advice on this, is illegal, because it now would impose a supermajority requirement on us in cases where there was a site plan and it was coming before us. Right now, the HPC makes a recommendation to us if it's in the historic district or near it, and, you know, we consider that in our deliberations. Under this new amendment, we would need a supermajority in order to approve a site plan if the HPC had not given it their approval. And to me, the concern I have, like writ large over all of this, is I see a lot of bad things coming from people being surprised by this, people thinking it's an arbitrary and unfair process that doesn't have a lot of very specific guidelines for what are you supposed to have in my house, you know, on Prospect. That's basically up to the HPC to decide things about architecture and integrity or aesthetics. And there isn't going to be any published kind of guidance really on, at least not the way the law is structured. And I'm pretty sure that the first time someone challenges this and says, I shouldn't have to fill out an application to put a flag on my front porch, and sues and says this is unconstitutional, I'm afraid that the village is going to spend a lot of money and lose, because There's a reason why the historic preservation laws make you make a district or go through the process of declaring a landmark so that people can vindicate their rights and have public meetings about it, et cetera. I think that trying to use this law to effectively say the whole village is a historic district, but it's not even about history. It's just about we want it to look nice and we want our HPC to be the judge of that. I just don't think that's allowed. And even if I thought it was allowed, I don't think it would be appropriate. And I think we've got lots of historic work to do in the district. I think in the village, I think that we could have districts, we could have landmarks. I'm all for participating in that process. I think honestly, you know, if you actually made districts or landmarks, maybe there could be money, you know, for the village for that, for new street signs, et cetera. It's hard to see how you get investment in or property appreciation from, we have a bunch of regulations governing us under our Historic Preservation Commission, but no, our house is not in any kind of landmark district or anything that we can advertise when we're selling our house. We don't have fancy street signs paid for by a foundation because it's in such and such historic district. I just see I have a lot of concerns. I want to get legal advice. I want us to return to this. I don't want to be negative and seen as negative, even though it must right now. But I'm just deeply concerned about this and look forward to being able to talk with our lawyers, talk as a board with our legal counsel privately, and have continuing discussions here with the village board, with HPC, to try to get to where I know Tom wants to get with this. Which is preventing slow motion kind of tragedies to neighborhoods. I think we're all behind that, but I want it to stick, and I want it to be fair, and I want it to be seen to be fair. And I'm very worried that we are heading to something right now that will not be seen to be fair. So that's my remarks on that. And I would like to close discussion on this subject, unless one of the members of the board has something else they want to raise right now before we move on. And hearing nothing from the members of the board, I'd like to do that. So we're already at 8:06, and I think we can talk through the next section much more quickly. It's a little more discreet, and we're gonna, you know, obviously like the first subject, have more time to discuss it. But the extent that members are not aware, the village board at its last meeting, and you can check out the proposed language and the materials through the links on the village board's agenda on the website. Basically, the hotel that we looked at as a proposal for the Moxie Cup site, the boutique hotel, the brick design, I think that we saw more or less sometime last year. And that was going to need a bunch of zoning variances to go forward, because hotels are not allowed in the B1 district where that is. The applicant has now petitioned the village to change the use table in the B1 zone to include a new category, not just hotels under the old definition, but a new definition called boutique hotels. And you can see, you know, in the language what that's supposed to be. You know, my take on it is it's a very, very specific description of what a boutique hotel is supposed to be. It sounds very much like the applicant's project, and that may or may not be okay. And I just think it merits further discussion down the road. The village board's also talked about adding this use to the NBR zone. And so I just wanted to kind of like open the floor to the members to talk about, you know, whether they remember the previous project and the issue that it wasn't zoned for hotel, any kind of initial thoughts people have about the idea, generally speaking, of allowing hotels, or specifically boutique hotels, in the B1 district, which goes from Main Street around Prospect to the eastern border of the village, and just, you know, a short section north of Main on Chestnut, and maybe also in the NBR. And just kind of get a general sense of where the board membership is feeling or thinking on that, and how much more thinking and you know, reviewing they sound like they're interested in doing. And I just wanted to get a feel for that, because if the village is going to go forward with that, they're going to need one of these advisory memos for us, from us, on what we think of adding this to the use table for these zones. You know, personally, I honestly don't have a lot of very strong opinions. I want to just look at it more and get some more advice on it and hear from you folks. So if I could just go through the board members and just, hear what anyone's thinking on this subject, I think it'd be great for all of us. Tom?
Well, first I have to confess ignorance. I'm not sure what the meaning of boutique hotel is. I know what a hotel is. I've stayed at a lot of hotels. So
the proposal gives a very, very specific definition of what a boutique hotel is that makes it not a hotel. For example, it can have no more, I believe, than 16 rooms. But there's the proposed legislation very narrowly says what a boutique hotel is. And I think one of the things for us to talk about going forward is, does the description of boutique hotel need to be less specific than that, more specific? Should we just be allowing hotels? That's one of the issues I think we need to discuss.
All right, so my position is that I am not opposed to there being hotels in the B1 district. I can imagine there being at least one hotel in the B1 district. You may know that I'm immediately adjacent to the B1 district. We have a lot of problems with traffic in New Paltz. There would be added traffic to deal with. But that would be true of most, if not all, forms of development. It's exactly what people were afraid of in the NBR district. But we were committed to having a district that had greater concentrations of people. And the NBR district is supposed to be a district that has greater concentrations of people. And even though it's supposed to be pedestrian friendly, America being what it is, people are likely to have cars. And so it's likely to increase traffic. That's likely to happen in downtown as well. But I am not opposed to a rational design of a hotel of some sort, of some size in the downtown, the B1 district.
Okay, Dennis?
Well, I pretty much agree with what Tom said. I think we need, I'm familiar with the building we're talking about. I see it every day. And as far as a boutique hotel and providing a nice architectural design, I have no objections at all to that.
Okay, and it just I don't want to mislead anybody going forward. We're gonna if presuming that they go forward with that project, I assume we'll have more application review. If for example the village board changes the zoning to allow it so they don't need variances, then they'll be back with us. But I do, I want to also just kind of as we go forward think about we're going to be asked not to just recommend on this project or this site if it goes forward, but these regulations for both zones if it comes to that. So I don't want to accidentally make people focus too much on that potential site as opposed to the implications of doing this for these zones. And maybe we should be thinking about, should we be doing it is there some other way? I want everyone to be thinking about their concerns about this kind of a change, not just here, but for any other zone where it could get, proposed for right now and potential other applications elsewhere within those districts. Dennis, thank you. Raquel?
Yeah, John, I think that the Runa project preceded me being on the board. That was, I think it was listed as a hostel. Anyway, yes. I'm just a little bit concerned. I don't understand, based off of the plans that were presented at the last meeting, how this project would fall under the purview of as a boutique hotel at all. But maybe I need to look back at it. I don't mean to use the term ironic, but it's funny that we're having these conversations on the same day because this is such a huge deviation from what HPC is, looking to accomplish. So I anticipate in general a lot of feedback. But, I think that I'm not against moving forward. I think that we live in a place that is clearly requiring additional dwelling units, even for, nightly stays. So I'm curious to see what they propose, but I just think that it seems like a bit of a loophole that's being proposed without actually realizing that they don't fall within that,
Well, yeah,
that
I would
definition.
So definitely, I mean, thank you for the reminder that, the thing about these districts is that, you can have bed and breakfast or hostels, but you can't have hotels, and motels are completely banned. So the way that they're trying to get around this, Raquel, is basically they're not fitting into any of those. They're proposing the village basically come up with a new use called, capital letters, boutique hotel. And then here's a definition of a boutique hotel. And so the project they're proposing definitely fits into their proposed definition for boutique hotel. But I think I encourage everyone just to go and look at that and take a look at the proposed language for boutique hotel. Because I guess the question for all of us is going to be, do we think we should have some new carve out kind of hotel to allow us to drop those kinds of things into the districts, but while still disallowing hotels? Should we be allowing bigger hotels? What should we do? I just want everyone to have kind of like full transparency into what it is that's being proposed, because we do have that information in front of us. So I thought as soon as we could start processing that, and in future meetings, just, kind of
John, just a quick question. Yeah. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Do we have any idea, or this was kind of a courtesy application?
Well, so the timing is interesting in that, like, the last village board meeting that it was at, they put a pin in it to get legal advice about some things. I think that's what the agenda said. But look, at any moment, the village board could decide they want to approve this change to the village code. But under the village code, before they do that, there has to be a public hearing. And before the public hearing happens, they have to ask us for an advisory memorandum about changing this part of the code. And the law says that we have up to 45 days to give them that memo. Now, we could go faster, especially if we had a head start and knew what we were thinking and could dive into it. But, they could kind of, I guess, kind of cold, if we didn't know about it, just come to us and say, hey, look, we want to change this part of the code and have a public hearing. We need a memo from you. We would then need to, within 45 days, technically speaking, come up with our recommendation. Does that answer that? Was that the kind of timing question you meant?
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Thanks.
Okay.
John and Raquel, also, 45 days always seems like a long time, but many times it's only one meeting, at most 2 meetings. And so you really have to consider that it's a very fast process of getting a report back. So John is very right that really, in order to meet that timeline, you sort of have to be thinking about it ahead of time. And then when you finally get the final language, look at that and decide what your reaction is.
Gotcha.
Okay. So unless anyone else on the board has something they want to kind of interpose, I'm going to make a motion here to close the regular session of our meeting and go into an executive session to receive attorney-client training and advice, which means we'd be saying goodbye, Tom, to you and Don. Do I have a second?
John, if I could just weigh in, it's really not going into executive session at all.
Oh. Okay, we're going to go into a privilege session.
You're just ending the meeting and you're going to have a
time for us to.
Okay, I hear you. Okay, so then I'm going to move to adjourn. Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Tom.
I was going to say, even the legal distinction doesn't really matter. I think it's probably time for us to cycle off. But I didn't want to miss the chance to say thank you very much. I've taken 2 very dense pages of notes. This is really helpful to us. And
thank you so much for coming.
I'm seeing some themes here that I think we can work with. I so wish we could meet face to face, because I feel like it would be a much more efficient way to get this going.
I can't agree with you more, Tom. I can't.
But for the foreseeable future, this is it.
This is it. Yep.
John, I want to thank you for giving us time on the agenda. I will try to follow up within the next week with just some impressions, and I'd be grateful if you'd share them with the whole planning board. Okay?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yep, absolutely. Alana, thank you for helping set this up.
All right. So
Thank
I'm
you.
going to move to,
Do I remember how to
Thank you.
leave meetings?
Thanks.
Yes, I do. Okay, thanks.
all right, I'm going to move to adjourn our meeting. And then we'll all just stick around on the Zoom call to talk to Rick. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Okay, Tom, how do you vote?
Muted myself. So aye.
Dennis, how do you vote?
Aye.
Raquel, how do you vote?
Aye.
And I vote aye. All right.
I'm just gonna end the stream.